Hello, my name is Jennifer Ehring, and I'm one of the nutritionists in the feed department at Tennessee Farmers Co-op. Today we're going to talk a little bit about poultry nutrition, some management practices, and some of the feeds that would be available to feed our poultry customers. Historically, poultry production in the U.S. has focused on layer, broiler, or pullet replacement operations. However, lately there has been a large movement towards smaller operations, with much of the recent increase in the area of backyard poultry and folks maintaining flocks of a dozen or so birds for egg and meat production. There are quite a few advantages to raising poultry over some of the other species. They have a high efficiency in terms of feed to gain ratio, and they're a pretty fast return on their investment. Poultry production also has a very low land requirement relative to some of the other species, so it works well for folks that don't have a lot of. Many folks like the idea of raising their own food, whether that's the meat or the eggs. There are a couple disadvantages. Relative to some of the other species, there tends to be a little bit higher disease and parasite potential, and they also have a relatively high level of daily management, so it's something that you have to check and monitor on a pretty frequent basis. The digestive system of the chicken or of the avian is a little bit different than some of the other species. Obviously, chickens don't have teeth, where some of the other species do, and so they have to rely on a little bit different mechanism to break down the feed that they consume. So when they begin to eat, they actually pick the feed up with their beak, and that feed travels down into the crop before it's really even broken down at all. The crop is basically just a storage unit where evolutionarily they've consumed feed and they've gone off somewhere safe where they can actually break down and digest that feed. A lot of times the feed would not necessarily be in a place that was safe to spend a lot of time. So the crop serves as a storage mechanism or a storage vessel where they can then go find somewhere else to actually break down and digest that feed. The proventriculus and the ventriculus is the next component in the digestive tract, and it is a very muscular organ, and it is basically where the breakdown and the grinding action occurs. So that muscle contracts, and there tends to be small pebbles or particles, or we use grit in that organ, and so the muscular action and the sharp edges of those pebbles work to break down those grains, break them down into small particle sizes that can actually be digested and absorbed by the chicken. Most of the absorption of the nutrients occurs in the small intestine, which is right after the gizzard. And then anything that might not be digested in the gizzard then moves into the ceca. And there, some microbial populations actually ferment any of the undigested material. And there's a little bit of absorption that goes on there, and then any of the waste is excreted after that. In terms of general nutrition of poultry, we focus on energy, protein, vitamins, and minerals, and of course water is important. And we rely on grain-based diets to provide these nutrients. A lot of people talk about the difference between a complete feed and a scratch feed, and there's quite a bit of difference, so it's an important differentiation to make. Complete feeds are those that have been, in a lot of cases, manufactured, and they're complete in terms of they have the appropriate balance of protein and energy and vitamins and minerals, where scratch feeds are simply a mixture of grains. And so they may or may not be completely fortified. And in many cases, straight grains contain some vitamin and mineral deficiencies that need to be addressed before we consider it a complete feed. The complete feeds that are available from the co-op, we have several feeds that are available that would be appropriate for different types of poultry, and they include starter feeds, grower feeds, and layer feeds. And we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those, but understand that those are all complete feeds, and that we can use scratch feeds and some other different feed type ingredients to supplement the diet, but providing that complete feed is important for a well-balanced diet. We also talk about feeding mashes and crumbles and pellets to poultry. Those are three different forms of feed. A mash would be a very small particle size. A crumble would be a small particle size that would be appropriate for for young growing birds, and then the pellet is even larger, and it would be more geared towards mature poultry. Obviously, their mouth is a little bit bigger, their digestive system is a little bit more developed, and so they can handle that little bit larger particle size. So I mentioned that we would want to feed a complete feed, a well-fortified diet, and then we could always go back and supplement the diet additionally. And we do that with scratch grains. Those are a combination of 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 different grains, and basically they're used as a supplemental energy source. They don't provide a tremendous amount of vitamins and minerals, but they do provide a good amount of energy. So it also gives the birds something to do. They have a natural pecking behavior. And to go along with that, we also have the poultry block, and it's the co-op peck block, and it is basically a press block that has a lot of exposed grains in it. And the same idea, it gives the birds something to do. They have this natural desire to peck. That is how they eat when they are out and about. And so if we provide them with a means or something to peck on, then they won't peck on each other. If there's not enough natural stimuli in the environment, sometimes you have problems with them pecking on each other. So this is a way to help that. Limestone, oyster shell, and grit are all 3 different types of ingredients that have kind of been confused in the past. Limestone and oyster shell are really just a source of supplemental calcium, and they are primarily supplemented to layer animals, layer birds that are producing eggs. So they need that additional calcium for a strong eggshell. And so if we need to provide additional calcium, these are the 2 ingredients that we're going to do that. There's been some confusion that we could use those 2 ingredients as a source of grit or to help with the digestive process, and that's not really their best use. Grit is different than limestone or oyster shell, and it typically is a granite type material, and so it's a much harder, much sharper type material, and so it does a much better job of breaking down the digestive, the material in the digestive tract. And then there's always the treats. A lot of people like to provide treats to their birds, but it is important that we not overlook the complete ration and not over supplement treat. In terms of basic poultry management, housing of course is important. You want to provide clean, dry place for birds to be. A roosting perch is necessary. They like to get up off the ground when it's time to roost for the evening. Nesting boxes are important for birds that are laying. So you want to provide nesting boxes, about 1 box per 4 to 5 hens if you have reproductive hens. In terms of the feed, we mentioned, feeding a complete feed, making it available to all the birds. So make sure that you have plenty of feeder space for the amount of animals or birds that you have. And then as far as health goes, having a clean, sanitary environment is important. And so cleaning pens regularly, keeping the barn or the coop where they're at well ventilated is important. Molting is something that birds go through typically on a yearly basis, and it's where they begin to lose all of their feathers. And so during this time, their egg production slacks off. Their nutrient requirements are actually pretty high, and because feathers are so high in protein, it's important to feed them a higher protein diet, realizing that they have to rebuild all those feathers once they've lost them. In terms of feeding specific types of backyard birds, the first one we'll talk about is layer chicks. And layer chicks, obviously they're a young growing animal, and so they have a pretty high protein requirement. They're building a lot of muscle. There's a lot of growth going on, and important to have a good vitamin mineral balance, because vitamin and minerals are so important for bone development that we need to have the appropriate balance there. And in terms of the co-op products, there's the 104 and 105, which are the all-natural chick starter and grower. And then we also have a medicated version, the 91-104 CR, and that is medicated to help with issues that birds face. If producers are wanting to go the medication route, there are several that prefer to go the all-natural route. So we have options for both of those types of customers. Those feeds are both a crumble, so they're that smaller particle, so the younger birds can eat it well. The young bird's digestive tract is not really well developed, so when they're younger, we don't necessarily need to offer them grit right away, but you want to begin offering it to them slowly. So a couple times a week, go ahead and sprinkle it over their feed. And then once they get to about 6 weeks of age, you can actually start offering them grain. And when I say grain, I'm talking about that supplemental scratch grain. Before, up to this point, you'd be offering them that well-fortified pellet. And it's always a good idea to offer that supplemental scratch and their fortified feed in 2 different troughs, and so you can monitor their intake better. You don't want them to overconsume on the scratch grain and not consume enough or the recommended amount of the complete feed. So you need to be able to monitor their intake. Mature birds, as those chicks grow, about 18 to 20 weeks of age, they're going to begin laying eggs. Their protein requirements are going to decrease, so you don't need quite as high as a protein diet, but their calcium requirements are going to increase quite a bit because of that added calcium needed for the eggshell. So that's where a layer feed comes in. Those starter grower feeds are really developed for those young growing birds, that higher protein content and a little bit lower calcium, whereas the layer feeds are really a higher calcium type diet. So you don't want to feed a layer feed to a young growing bird because that calcium to phosphorus ratio is actually quite a bit out of balance for a young bird. So it's always a good idea to feed the appropriate feed for the appropriate aged bird. Broilers, there's a few of those out there in terms of the backyard poultry. Obviously, they have a little bit higher protein requirement because we're pushing them to grow fast. We want to develop a lot of that muscle, so we tend to feed them more and feed them a little bit harder. There is a product out there, an all-natural meat bird starter grower that would be appropriate for these young birds all the way up to the time when they're ready to harvest. And then again, let's go ahead and offer that grit to help with that digestive process. Some of the other backyard poultry that we may see, we see a few turkeys. Turkeys have a little bit higher protein requirements than chickens, and so in that starter phase, what we'd actually recommend they do is go ahead and offer the 194 crumble, the game bird starter, and that is a higher protein feed, and you can do that for a few weeks, and then once they get going, you can go ahead and offer either the 91-107 all natural meat bird starter grower, or you can go ahead and offer the 191 CR, which is the game bird grower and finisher. Either one of those feeds would be appropriate for those growing and mature birds. And then the laying birds, again, they have that high calcium requirement for the eggshell quality. So we'd go back to feeding the all-natural layer feed to those laying turkeys. A few people have geese and ducks. They really can be fed quite similarly to chickens. The only difference is that we want to make sure that we use an all-natural type chicken feed because if it does contain a coccidiostat, we can have issues. Ducks don't handle those well, so we want to make sure that it does not have that medication in it. Ducks, for whatever reason, tend to prefer a pellet or a crumble over a mash. And with geese, it's actually important to give them access to pasture. So we don't think about birds eating a lot of grass, but for geese, it is important for the health of their digestive system to allow them access to some of that forage. And then offer grit as well. Considerations that you need to think about as you begin talking to customers about raising poultry. You'll have a lot of new customers probably coming in that aren't familiar with raising birds or taking care of animals. But in general, if you take the time to talk through setting up their facilities appropriately so that they can handle the birds easily, and selecting the appropriate feeds, monitoring their daily intake, monitoring behaviors. A lot of time if behaviors start to change in birds, it's an indication that something might be going wrong. So as long as a customer is willing to spend some time in watching them, they will probably have a very successful endeavor in terms of their poultry production. And if you have any additional questions, certainly don't hesitate to contact your local feed specialist. We're happy to help in any way that we can.